a balloon of sinus. It's basically an empty space that, unless you have a head cold, in which case it's not so empty, but generally it's just an empty space that allows your voice to resonate within your own head. And you also have your nasal sinuses, the ones sort of underneath your eyes, but this is big space above your eyebrows that is a major part of your voice having resonance, of it sounding the way that our voices do. So the star child is missing that resonating chamber. It has a very, very small mouth, a very unusually shaped mouth, such that it would be difficult for this being to have accommodated a tongue and to be able to speak the way that we speak. So there's certainly some evidence that it's not designed to communicate in the same way that we do. And the fact that it has a much larger brain and so many differences about it, if it is indeed an alien or a hybrid, there's no telling what kind of capabilities a creature like that would have, a being like that would have. So it could very likely be some kind of telepathic communication, although at this point we just don't have the evidence for me to be able to say yes for sure one way or another.
Now, have you ever read The Day After Roswell by Colonel Philip Corso?
I haven't read the book in its entirety, but I've certainly read segments of it, and really the amount of information in that book is incredible. And I assume that you're going to refer to the alien beings that he said were discovered and the different elements of their physiology in relation to the Star Child skull.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's some similarity there, isn't there?
There absolutely is. For anyone that hasn't read the book, it's definitely worth the read, but he talks at length about the skeletal structure of the beings that they claim to have found, and I have no reason to doubt that they did. I think that they really did find something absolutely not from this world, but he describes the skeletons as being much smaller and having much thinner bones than a normal human would have. They're small beings, about 4 foot tall, according to the book, with these very thin, very light bones, and he described them as being fibrous. And this is important. I'll explain in a minute, but just remember, he describes them as being fibrous and saying that the bones seem to be stronger and possibly more flexible than normal human bones. So we're dealing with the Star Child skull, which of course is a bone. The bone of the Star Child skull is about half as thick as normal human bone and weighs about half as much, so much thinner, just like the bones that Corso was describing. We haven't done any flexibility tests on it, so I can't speak to that one, but I can tell you that it is substantially stronger than normal human bone. When they went to cut samples of the bone for some of the DNA testing that was done, there is actually 2 skulls. There is the Star Child skull, and then there is a completely normal human female skull that just happens to have been found in the exact same mine tunnel. It's the exact same age. They very likely died at exactly the same time or within a few hours or a few days of each other. So we have a second skull that's completely normal and completely human that we use as a comparison for things with the Star Child. It's basically our control mechanism. So when we do a test, if we get DNA out of the human skull, we know that there should be DNA in the Star Child skull because they've been exposed to the same kind of environmental stresses that would cause the DNA to degrade. So we have the normal human skull, and they go to cut into that with the surgical blade that they use, and it's an electric blade, it's a rotary cutting tool, and they go to use it, and it just slices through that bone as if it was butter, exactly the way that it's supposed to. And then they go and they get a clean blade, same kind of blade, brand new, clean, and they go to try and cut the Star Child skull. It bounces off the bone. It cannot cut it. The scientist that's doing it puts his entire body weight into it to try and get it to cut. There's a massive amount of bone dust. The air is filled with that acrid, tooth-burning smell, which is actually burning collagen. The bone is completely different. It is so much harder than the normal human bone that for the next cut, they switch to a diamond-tipped blade, and that is able to cut the bone. But we're talking about substantially harder bone. So we have thinner bone, like Corso described. We have harder bone, like Corso described. And then we take some of those samples and we put them under a very powerful microscope that gives us a black and white picture. It's called a scanning electron microscope, or an SEM. We put one of the samples under this microscope and we look at it under high magnification. And we can see growing out of the matrix of the bone fibers. Remember, Corso said that he described the bones as being fibrous, and it's hard to know exactly what he meant, but we absolutely have fibers inside the matrix of the star-child bone, and you can see pictures of this at the website www.starchildproject.com. There are books written about it that are available through that website as well. It will blow your mind if you haven't seen it before. They are the most bizarre things. There are all different shapes and sizes woven through this bone. It's like steel reinforcing concrete. And there's been a lot of speculation that that could very likely be the thing that gives the bone its extra strength. And by the way, for anyone who's wondering, we examined the possibility that it might be some kind of foreign contamination, like a fungus or a bacteria. We had some mycologists come and look at the images. They all said to a person, this doesn't look like any kind of organic thing growing in the bone. This is something that is indigenous to the bone. Whatever this is, it's supposed to be in this bone. We don't know how that's possible, but it doesn't appear to be any kind of foreign contaminant. So we have basically in every way a bone that matches the description that Corso gave for alien bones.
If this bone is that much harder than a normal human bone and it has a different kind of fiber altogether, how does the skeptic rationalize that?
Well, mostly that's one of those convenient details that they just forget. There are a wealth of, well, I probably used a bad word there, I wouldn't call it a wealth, but there is a large number of very unfortunate medical conditions that can cause all kinds of deformity and unusual shaping of the cranial region. There are more illnesses and mutations than you can poke a stick at that can cause really strange shaped skulls. And so every time we go through and explain why it's not one particular kind of deformity, someone else comes along and says, aha, but what about this other one that you didn't explain yet? And because we don't explain every single itty-bitty one to that specific person, they jump up on their soapbox and say, well, they couldn't tell me that it wasn't this, therefore I know for a fact it's progeria or it's cradle-boarded, or they wouldn't answer my questions, and so they're obviously hoaxsters. And, you know, we really do try to get to everyone, but a lot of the time people just go out and write skeptical articles without consulting us at all, without even bothering to ask us questions. And in fact, the major skeptical article written about the star-child skull was written by Dr. Steve Novella, and it was written, I think, in 1999. Way back when we just had gotten the skull, before I ever came on board, when they'd done hardly any testing on it at all. And this guy writes an article saying how everyone involved is just off their tree and there's nothing here that's worth looking at all. And we, years later, wrote him a very nice explanation as to why so many of the points in his article are now wrong. And he just wrote back and basically said, I don't care. I've written my article, it stands as is. He really didn't care that we've now gone through and done so much more research and proven that a lot of the things that he said are absolutely wrong. Some of them were wrong when he wrote them, but a great many more of them were proven wrong later on. And once people take a position on something like this, it's hard to get them to come off that, to change their mind about it. No one wants to look silly, and it's hard to admit when you're wrong about something. So there's just so many reasons why people choose not to look at the evidence for this, but it's getting overwhelming. It's getting to the point where you pretty much literally have to have your head stuck in the sand not to see that this is really an incredible bone.
But a deformity wouldn't make the bone harder, though, would it?
No, there are deformities that make the bone harder, but they make it thicker. There are deformities like progeria, for example, is a congenital birth deformity that causes premature aging in young children. It's fatal. It's a really horrible condition, and we would like at some point in the future to be able to contribute to research into it, because people say that's what the star child is so often. And it does indeed make the bone thinner, but it also makes it weaker. It's basically giving the bone osteoporosis, giving a 2 or 3 year old osteoporosis. And so of course the bone does become thinner. But to have something that makes the bone thinner and harder and put these crazy fibers in it that no one's ever seen before, there is no explanation for that. There's not even 3 separate things that do that somehow we could explain and cobble together. There is just nothing about this skull that can really be explained by any known natural cause.
So there is this deformity called progeria that will make the bone harder. Has there ever been a case of this deformity that made the bone so hard that you had to use a diamond-tipped blade to cut it?
Well, I'm sorry. Progeria actually makes the bone weaker. There are ossification diseases where the bone basically gets too much calcium in it, and then the bone does get harder, but it usually makes it more brittle. It makes it so you wouldn't even need to cut it. You could just snap pieces off, and the star child bone certainly isn't like that. There really is nothing anywhere that explains the bone being so much thinner and harder. Back in 2003, we had a panel of experts, 11 different experts, headed by Dr. Ted Robinson, who sat down and over a period of, I believe, several months, tried to figure out, was there anything in the books, was there anything anyone had ever heard of, any case reported of anything that could explain the star child skull being the way that it is. And they concluded time and time again that all of the things that we were hearing at that time, that it was cradle-boarded, that it was hydrocephalic, that it had some kind of artificial head binding for cultural reasons, everything that they could think of, they went through and basically came up with very solid explanations as to why that's not the case in the star child skull. And this is something that anyone can really look at the skull and see for themselves. It's not like you have to have a huge amount of medical background or anything. Once you know what to look for, any person can look at the skull and say, oh yeah, I see, I understand what they're talking about. They're right. This couldn't be cradle-boarded, for example, because, and for those of you who don't know, cradle-boarding is where an infant, a very young infant, is strapped to a board. The head of the child is actually strapped to a hard, flat board so that the mother can then tie the child to her back and continue on her work without having to worry about the child's weak neck bobbing around and giving it neck damage or causing suffocation. It sounds, again, I know a little strange, but it's very common. It's perfectly safe for the baby. It's still done today in a lot of places in the world. It's called cradle boarding, and it does cause a flattened rear of the head. I mean, absolutely flat back of the head, because you have a baby with a very soft skull whose skull is being pressed from the back into a hard board. And so the result is a skull that is as flat as that board at the rear of the skull. And the star child skull does have a very unusually flattened back portion of the head. It's called the occipital region. And so, of course, people said, oh, well, that flattening is just cradle boarding. We see that all the time in places all over the world. Why are you trying to tell us that that's anything unusual? Well, the first reason is that the position of the cradle board couldn't possibly have been done in such a way that it would cause flattening of the kind seen in the star child. In order to flatten the back of the skull in the way it was done in the star child, you'd have to press the child's head so far forward down into its throat that pull its chin down into its chest so much that the poor child would suffocate. So that's absolutely impossible. And secondly, when you have a cradle-boarded skull, if you just take that skull and rest it on the table, so the back of the head is resting on the table or a flat surface, it'll just sit there. It's perfectly smooth. It has a flat edge to rest against a flat surface. The star child skull does not have a flat edge like that. If you put it on a tabletop, it kind of wobbles all over the place just because it doesn't have that completely artificial flattened edge. And anyone, once you explain this to them, they can look at it and they can see it. A 5-year-old can see this. A 5-year-old can understand it once you explain it to them. But if you take it to an expert who's pressed for time or who doesn't really want to take a look at it, they'll just have a quick cursory 2-second look and they'll say, oh, well, that's cradle-boarded, and that's the